In 1972, on a rainy Alabama road, the van in which Mitchell May was riding was hit head-on by a speeding car. The crash was so devastating that it took rescuers 45 minutes to free him from the wreckage and left him with many critical injuries. The most serious were to his legs, which sustained over 40 fractures, as well as severe nerve and muscle damage. Although his doctors insisted he would never walk on his own again, Mitchell believed differently. Determined to regain the use of his legs, he began his own intensive and decidedly unconventional healing program. Mitchell went on to make medical history by regenerating nerve, bone, and muscle in a way that the medical community had deemed impossible. His healing was so phenomenal that it has been documented and studied by medical researchers and featured in periodicals and documentaries. Today, Mitchell racewalks, backpacks, and hikes in the canyons near his home. And Mitchell May is our guest today as we explore the nature of healing, what healing is all about. Join us for the next hour as we speak with Mitchell May, talk about how he lives his life and how he's come to understand healing and what healing is about. Mitchell, welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like to take you back to that time after that accident. What did you feel like? What was happening for you after that accident?
Well, at the time of the accident, I wasn't too aware because of the extensiveness of the injuries, and I was actually pronounced dead at the scene of the accident. And they transported me after cutting me out of the wreckage to the hospital. And when I regained consciousness, I hovered in and out near death for several days. And the doctors told me that I would never be walking again on my own. And because of the amount of shock and the amount of injuries that I had, it hadn't really sunk into me what that meant. It wasn't until my family started being able to arrive and the medication started to take a little bit of effect, and then I got some very severe infections, that I realized how serious my injuries were. And every direction I looked, people said, it's impossible for you to ever return to the way of life you had before.
And the doctors really wanted to amputate your leg, right?
Yes, they didn't amputate my leg at the time because, again, the injuries were so severe, they didn't think I could take any more trauma to my body and to my legs. And after about a week at this primary hospital, they transferred me to a major medical center in Nashville, Tennessee, where I stayed there for about 6 weeks, trying to stabilize my condition. And my condition was that I had 40 fractures, the majority from my hips down. I had several inches of bone below the knee completely gone. All the nerves below my knee were severed. The muscles gone. The ankle joint didn't exist anymore. The knee joint didn't exist anymore.
This was pretty severe.
Yeah. And my lungs were punctured. A lot of my organ systems were not able to operate, and they didn't think that they would return to full function again. And then some very serious infections set in, given that the wounds were exposed.
So what kind of time span are we talking about here? Weeks, months?
From the original accident, I was in the major hospital for a week, and then for 6 weeks at Vanderbilt Hospital. And I deteriorated while I was there, going in and out of coma, going in and out of essentially dying and having to be resuscitated. And then I was transferred to UCLA Medical Center, where my family is housed, and my father's on faculty there. And they thought that would be the best place for me to try to rehabilitate and get used to the fact that my leg or legs were going to need to be amputated and that I'd have to be in a wheelchair.
They were talking about amputating your second leg as well.
Possibly because I was refusing to have my one leg amputated, and the infections had become systemic and they had gone into my blood system. I had lost a great deal of my vision, lost a great deal of my hearing, and they said it was going to spread to the other leg.
So why were you refusing to have your leg amputated? Did you have a reason why
This is a very good question. At the time, I didn't have any sort of cosmic revelation as to why. I just knew that there was something inside of this experience for me that I needed to get, and that if I just went along with what other people were telling me, what my life would be, and what I needed to do, that I wouldn't get it. And it was at a real shifting point in my life. I had been in search of myself prior to that. And I was just in the beginning stages of knowing who I was. And I knew that there was some secret, some key inside this whole experience. And if I didn't claim it, if I didn't own this experience as mine, but simply let other people make life decisions for me, I would be missing something absolutely central to my being.
Was there anyone there to support that decision you were making to refuse the
At that time,
application?
no. At that time, I was on my own.
So it was very courageous. I mean, you were totally surrounded by people saying, do this, and do this, and you were refusing to do it.
I would say that my parents, were very supportive
Some people
of
might have said
me.
you were stupid.
I've had that spoken to me before. And I went with that, motive of mine that I need to inhabit this experience all the way. And I left with that to UCLA. They flew me there in a full body cast from my neck down to the bottom of my feet. And I was met at UCLA by a whole...
I think that was the plane ride where they forgot the medication.
Yeah, yes, it was.
That must have been a plane ride from hell.
That was a wild ride for me. I had to take 4 first-class seats and put me on a stretcher to make it there. And when I got to UCLA, I was met by this whole priesthood lineage of orthopedic physicians. And as soon as they saw me and saw my condition, they scheduled me to have my leg amputated immediately. And I said no, that's not the way I wanted this to go, unless it was actually going to cost my life to save my leg. And they were about to get a court order to force me to amputate. And they said even if I could save the leg, it would be absolutely useless. It would never be able to bear weight. It would never be able to bend, and so forth. And my mother, in desperation, because I was in excruciating pain, my nerves were severed and therefore totally exposed to the open air. And there was no way of stopping that kind of pain. It's the name for it is causalgia.
So just to give our listeners a sense of what
Sure.
this pain is like, it's kind of if you've ever had a toothache, an abscess toothache, or where the nerve is exposed in your tooth, and probably everybody out there listening has had this happen at some point in your life. This is where a lot of those together, like just multiply it 50 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. That's the kind of pain we're talking about.
24 hours a day. There was no escape from it. And that was the place that I didn't know if I could bear that. And so in that space of desperation, my mother was seeking to see if there was somebody who could help with the pain. And none of the doctors said there was any hope of solving this pain unless we amputated above the injury site. And at that time at UCLA in 1972, they had a parapsychology lab, and under the leadership of Thelma Moss. And they were working with a man who was a healer named Jack Gray. And my mother had no idea what she was opening the door to. And she called Thelma Moss, and Jack Gray had already told her, Thelma Moss, that she would be getting a call. And he agreed to take it on as a research case for the parapsychology lab, and the orthopedic physicians agreed to take it on as a research case. And I had no experience with healing before, really didn't know what it was about, sort of expected when I was told this healer was going to come that some guy in a purple cape was going to show up. And in walked an absolutely ordinary-looking man with some rather intense eyes. And one of the first things that I noticed was when anybody walked by my bed, I would scream in pain as if they were actually knocking into my leg. And everybody just thought I was very sensitive and afraid that they would knock into my leg, but I was insisting they were actually hitting my leg. And when Jack came in, the first thing he did was he stopped when he got to my leg and he put out his hand and he traced this sort of energy trail that went around my leg. And he walked completely around it. He totally, recognized that there was this extension of me. Prior to that, no one, had noticed that. And then he walked over to where I was, in the bed. And he said to me, he was a very direct guy. And he looks at me straight on and he says, "Mitchell, you were created in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, everything you need is already within you. We can heal this leg. There's no big deal, no big problem." And when he said that, for the moment, for about a quarter of a second, I totally understood the whole nature of life. And then I lost it, of course. And my time spent with him was about regaining that awareness and letting the healing bloom forth from that awareness with him. And he had a lot of tricks up his sleeves to assist me in accessing that space so that the healing could take place and we could regenerate nerve, bone, and muscle in a way that was medically not possible.
Can you name one?
Sure, I could name several. Foremost for me was the use of his hands. Either at a distance from my body or actually on my body. Some people would call that laying on of hands, but there was almost a dance to it with his hands. His hands would, dance around me in a certain way. He used a lot of light and color. He used sound. He took me into very deep trance states by following his voice through different worlds. All the time leading me back to myself. All the time leading me back into my own being and letting the energy, the life, the essence come forth from me rather than him. That was a central theme for him, that the healing would come from within me. It would not come from him. And he would come at 6 o'clock at night and stay until 6 in the morning for the first several nights and then go right to work and then return. And after 3 days...
He never seemed tired or drained or anything?
He was an old-timer. He was up in his late 60s by this time. He was just totally on fire all the time. And after 3 days of working at this intense level like this, I woke up in the early morning and the pain was completely gone. And there had been no change in the physiology. The nerves were still exposed, the infections were still there, I still had 2.5 inches of bone missing, and yet the pain was gone. And the doctors just could not understand this. So much so that he gave me control of when the pain could come back on. So when the doctors were there checking my leg, I could let the pain return so they could see what was right and what was wrong. And when they would leave, I could click the pain off. And I thought that's all he was going to do. I thought he'd come for this, several days, and that would be that. And he kept coming. And we kept working with one another. And in our work together, slowly, the nerves began to regenerate, the bone began to regenerate, the muscle began to regenerate. And we kept deepening our relationship together. And after about 3 months of time with him, he said he had been waiting for somebody to teach, that he had been doing this healing work for 40-some years, and that if I wanted to, I was the one he had been waiting for. And I wasn't going anywhere. Wow. I was sort of a captive audience. And so I said yes to that because I knew that that's really what my life wanted to be about.
You mentioned clicking the pain on and off.
Mm-hmm.
How did you do that? Can you share that with our listeners?
I can try to do that. It was a matter of identification. If I identified with just the wounded part of myself, which I would call sort of just the smaller self only, then that's all that I had access to. When I began to identify with a larger self, then the wounded part became a part of that. But if I kept my awareness in my vaster self, it wasn't all that I was. And I have found that very helpful for a lot of people that I work with who are in tremendous pain, whether it's, from cancer or from injuries or migraine headaches or whatever it is, where their identification is with who they are, the story of who they think they are.
So as your leg started healing, what were the doctors doing? Or were they hanging around saying you still need to get your leg amputated, or what was going on?
There were a lot of politics going on. The head of orthopedics refused to treat me anymore. His ego was so offended that we were not going his way, and that here was this uneducated man who came in and was affecting change in me that was impossible. He couldn't handle that. The head of infectious disease was irate. We were just very fortunate to have found a orthopedic doctor at the hospital who gave permission for this to take place and really stuck by us, even though he did not at the time believe in it. Henceforth, for television and so forth, he's come forward, about the miraculousness of the case. And so we really, in many ways, had to go it alone. And they kept saying, though, even though, the bone is growing and even though the nerves are growing, you'll still never walk, you'll never be pain-free, you'll never this. And Jack's response was, who knows the future? If you stay open to it being absolutely mysterious from moment to moment, then anything is possible. But if your story outlines how it's going to go, then you have very few possibilities available to you. And that's been my experience with my own healing and assisting other people to regenerate or to heal or to go further in their life, is to take a look at what their story is and what the possibilities are in their story.
Yeah. So how long were you in the hospital?
I was in the hospital a full year.
Wow.
In intensive care.
Wow.
Confined. It became sort of a meditation cell for me. I was in isolation because I had these rampant infections.
Yeah.
So I spent an enormous amount of time alone, which was glorious for me because I got to practice all the things that Jack was teaching me. I got to try them. And to me, that's healing is not so mysterious. It's really not a lot different than other art forms. It takes practice.
So were you able to walk out of the hospital?
No, I wheeled out in a wheelchair.
Uh-huh.
I spent a couple years in a wheelchair.
Probably made that surgeon feel a little better anyway.
And I spent about a year and a half in metal braces, and each step of the way, I had to relearn to walk from scratch. I had to crawl. I had to go through this whole evolutionary process, and I had to let my body be very creative because I have certain body parts that were gone, and they're still gone. And yet I can do whatever I want and need to do because I learned how to let the creative forces evolve into what was possible instead of trying to return to what I was. And that to me is where it gets very exciting in healing, is to let the creative adaptation occur.
So you were in a wheelchair for a while, for a few years.
Yes.
Yeah. And then you got out of the wheelchair and you had to teach yourself to walk all over again.
Yes.
So how many years are we talking about now?
Oh, probably 4.5 years in that sequence, and all the while, Jack is teaching me very intensely. We're very inseparable for all that time, and almost really for 7 years, the whole route of that went, both with the healing and my apprenticeship, so to speak, with Jack until he passed away.
So where were you at this point, 7 years into it? Where were you then? I mean, were you able to walk?
Oh, yeah. I was out doing my thing and had returned to college and, was beginning to work with other people who were in circumstances like my own, or whatever their life, troubles were. And even to this day, I feel like I'm still healing.
Yeah.
I'm still expanding and improving and refining certain capacities in my own structure.
So, besides this remarkable healing process and journey that you went through, other parts of your life changed from what it was before the accident. And I'd like to talk about those, how your life shifted in other ways, not just the healing of the leg, but so can you talk a little bit about that?
I'd love to. For me, what the accident triggered for me was it literally blew me into pieces. And in that process, and I feel that happens to everybody in their life at some point, whether it happens emotionally or psychologically, financially, their life is blown apart. And it's in that being blown apart that a whole new world can enter if you're willing. And I happen to really be fortunate in having somebody take me into another world. And because I was, in a sense, dismembered and taken apart, and I had to go into the underworld, really, and to die, and to face, a tremendous amount of fear and pain and disillusionment, and just being scattered. In that process of refinding myself and bringing these fragments back into some type of wholeness structure, which took many years, I would say that the life of the soul was really responsible for my healing. That's really what brought me together. There was a lot of tools and techniques and so forth that were absolutely critical and valuable, but it blew me open so much that the soul was able to come forward, and that's the dimension that really runs the show in my life now. And that's the dimension that really heals, and that's the dimension that I have most interest in when I'm with somebody else, is how to bring that in so it's embodied in the body.
Do you have a particular spiritual practice that you follow?
Yes, but I mean, it's definitely, I wing it. I don't follow any traditional path, but my life is very much, ritualized in that way for myself, from, early morning when I arise, and, sitting in meditation for an hour and a half, period of time. But it's something I really attempt to do all day long. And to use my life itself as my spiritual practice, rather than having my spiritual practice and then I get on with my life, and then when my daily life and my business is done, I get back to my spiritual practice. That, to me, doesn't work. Yeah. It's my life presents me with enough challenges and dilemmas that it keeps me on my toes and requires me to be very present. And that's what I like, to be present.
At some point, you decided to leave the city of L.A. and Southern California. Yeah. Where did you go?
Where I'm settled now is in the remote wilderness parts of southeastern Utah, in the Four Corners area. And I was on a camping expedition out there, just on a vacation, and I just fell in love with the silence and the spaciousness and the beauty out in the Red Canyon rocks, and sort of built a cabin out there. And
this is one of those areas they call virtually uninhabited, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And people do come to see me there and so forth, but I really love it out there.
And you grow your own food?
Mm-hmm. We have quite a garden, and I have a wonderful family out there. And
you have electricity?
I generate electricity from the sun. I had to figure out how to do that one. And
you have a telephone?
I do now. For the first few years, I didn't have a telephone.
Oh. And where does your water come from?
We have a well, and we collect the rainwater off the roof, and that's how we water the garden. And we save our vegetables in the winter in a root cellar. And
don't get a lot of rain there, do you?
No, we don't.
What, 7 inches a year?
7 to 8 inches. It's a desert.
Yeah.
And you have to pay attention to how you deal with your water.
Yeah. So tell us how a typical day for you now goes.
A typical day for me is waking up somewhere around 5 in the morning. And as I say, I meditate for about an hour and a half, and I do some breathing exercises for about 20, 30 minutes. And then mostly these days I have a business that I've started, a product called Pure Synergy that developed out of my healing experience. I was looking to create a supplement for myself that would nurture life force. And I tried all kinds of commercially available supplements, and I found they didn't nurture my life force. So I decided I had to create one, and it took me about almost 15 years.
Something you used to mix up personally for your friends.
Right, in the kitchen sink,
and
literally.
Too many of them kept asking for it, right?
Too many became, dozens and dozens and hundreds and so forth.
Yeah.
And so now it's a real business, and we had to get a laboratory and, facilities for bottling and the whole works.
We're going to continue with our conversation with Mitchell May and our exploration of healing, what healing is all about, in just a moment. Mitchell, before we began this interview, we were talking about you take trips down the Grand Canyon,
Yes.
the river, Colorado
Yes.
River. Tell us about that.
Well, nature is, for me, one of the greatest healers that I know of, and one of the greatest teachers has been in my life. It totally nourishes me all the way down to the marrow of my bones. And I like to go out for extended periods of time. And one of those trips I was on was about 4 weeks down to the Grand Canyon. And you really go right into the intestines of the earth when you're down there. And there's a particular section down there that we were talking about earlier called the Inner Gorge. And it's where the rock is completely black. And if you go in the fall, time of the year, the sun never shines in there. And the rock that's exposed in there is hundreds of millions of years old. So you feel all these archetypal forces at play in the water and the wind and the intensity of what formed.
Can you see the sky?
If you look straight up, there's a sliver of sky. Other than that, that's it. You are back in the womb of the earth.
You find people get claustrophobic in there?
Some people start to lose it in there. And it's a very transformative time if it's skillfully used. And I've been fortunate, the people that we go down with go there, in a sense, to use the energies of being down in there for transformation. And when you're down in there, a lot of your darkness and a lot of your fear begins to emerge, which to me is what healing's all about, is, that willingness to feel whatever is in there that you've been avoiding in your life. And the inner gorge, I've never seen anybody who hasn't brought that out in. And, people are sure that they're going to break up with their wife. Everything was happy before, and all of a sudden. And if you continue to go through that and feel it and experience it, by the time you make it to the gorge, you're reborn. And you emerge, back into the light, literally. You emerge back into openness, and the rock goes from black, into red rock. And it's a real celebration.
Yeah, I bet. How many people on this trip, say?
On that particular trip, there was probably about 15 of us for about a month.
And so this is not the typical Grand Canyon River run.
No. This is
a much longer run.
Yeah, and one thing I sometimes do, and we have friends out there, is we make special trips for people who want to go on transformational journeys out into nature. So to use nature as a healing medium, which it absolutely is. It is in my life, and I have seen it be in many other people's lives.
Yeah. So you would spend 4 days in the Inner Gorge.
Yeah, you don't have a choice. There's no way out.
So it takes 4 days to get through it.
Yeah. Depending on the time of year. Yeah, you can't really go faster at this time of year, given the nature of the flow of water. In the summertime, which I haven't been down in the summertime, apparently you go through it much faster because there's more water flowing through.
Yeah. So it's much slower, is what you're saying?
Yes.